And when we're desperate, things tend to take longer and we tend to argue more and we tend to be more assertive. When it's happening ahead of time, it's like, hey, we're going to need to know this in the next couple of days. And we get the answer in a couple of days and everybody's happy. Well, during the sprint, you can't say, I need the answer in the next couple of days. I need it in the next couple of minutes.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Real Agile or BS. I'm your host, Peter Saddington, with my colleague at Agile, Bob from Agile for All, and we are here to answer your frequently asked questions. And today we're going to take on a new one. It's, should development teams help with refining the backlog? Is it Real Agile or BS? Let me quickly define it in a simple terms. Backlog refinement. What is it all about? Well, you guys, many of our viewers out there know that Agile teams use a backlog, and this backlog is essentially all of the work necessary to complete the project or the program. And so one of the things that we want to make sure that we do is we constantly and continuously break down those user stories, i.e. requirements, into smaller chunks where we can have conversations, we can have confirmation of what those ideas are, and they can be deliverable in small chunks within a period of an iteration. Now, and many of you guys know that a product owner, one of their primary responsibilities is to constantly refine that backlog and break stories down so they can have those effective conversations with development teams. In many ways, some teams have refinement meetings or backlog grooming meetings where they meet with the development team to help break those stories down as well. And so we're going to dig into this a little bit. Should development teams help with breaking down the backlog in backlog refinement? Is it Real Agile or BS? Let's let Agile Bob take the first crack at it.
Well, Peter, I think that many teams are led astray when they see that the product owner is responsible for the backlog and they think they're responsible for everything about the backlog. And that leads them to the situation where the product owner is the only one ever touching the backlog. And I think that the Scrum Guide makes it very clear that development teams should spend at most 10% of their time helping with backlog refinement. And that's an at most, not a at least. But it also doesn't say they should spend zero time doing it. I look at backlog refinement as something the development team does in this sprint to help their next couple of sprints be really successful. So it's an investment and not overhead. And many teams look at it just as overhead. So from a pure question of, is it Real Agile or BS? It's definitely Real Agile. It's in the Scrum Guide itself. But the thing that really puts it over the top for me is when I see teams that when they don't get involved in it, what happens? What happens is they end up with stories that end up to be fairly large, and the product owner doesn't know how to break along value boundaries. They know how to break along technical boundaries. And so we end up with stories that are component based versus feature based, which is something that we kind of had it with our component versus feature team episode a while back. And as a result, they don't end up with a valuable story. They have a database story and a user interface story and a backend story, and they then have to integrate all of that, and it makes a big mess. Whereas a development team can take a slice of a story and say, okay, this piece of this will have some value, this piece of this will have some value, this piece of this will have some value, and we're still constantly building value out of those smaller stories. So I think that's really where the development team comes in. And also, as our colleague Richard Lawrence has said in the past, it's one of those things where you would never ask the development team to do their job without being able to ask the product owner for help. Well, just like the product owner can't do their job without asking the development team for help. And so it's a two-way street here. And the bottom line is we need to end up with a backlog that's refined, that we all understand, that we can attack every sprint effectively and not have 10,000 questions during the sprint, because that's an item that never should have gotten in. So I think definitely for the purposes of this, totally Real Agile, and I would definitely encourage it.
Absolutely. So I have a couple questions for you that I'm channeling the questions that I get from many students. Some students would say, well, Bob, Peter, Scrum is already asking a lot, right? We have a sprint planning, we have a daily Scrum, we have a review, we have a retrospective. If it's a large program, we have release planning. And now you're adding in this grooming or refinement meetings that we have to have with the product owner and the team. How often should we do this? Should we do it every day? Should we do it once a week, twice a week? What would be your answer, Bob?
Wow, that's a pretty loaded question there, Peter. So the Scrum Guide says it's a continuous activity, whatever that means, or at least it used to say continuous activity. I look at it as I want the team somehow to invest per person an hour or two per sprint to do backlog refinement. And my goal is for them to then save an hour or two in sprint planning, as well as a few hours during the sprint with questions that they would have had to ask later and really been in a rush to get the answers for. So I don't really tell people to do it as a meeting or an event. In fact, I try to discourage away from that in many cases. Let's put it in a place that's easily accessible. Let's put those stories somewhere where we can collaborate in near real time, maybe a wiki page of some sort or something where we can have some sort of rich media format that we can use. But let's work on it asynchronously as much as we can, so we don't all have to stop at the same time, go do this other activity, and then get back to what we were doing. I might
Mm,
stop at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and do some backlog refinement because I don't want to start something before the end of the day. You might, in the middle of the day, say, "Hey, I'm done with this item. Before I start the next one, we're getting close to the end of the sprint. Maybe I should do some backlog refinement, see what's out there." But we can all do it at separate times. Make comments on those pages and still see it all happening. Teams that are mature can do this a little bit better than teams that are new to it. So when you're new, you might need to have another meeting or event, but it's not a necessary evil.
absolutely. I think in a lot of ways, what you're espousing here assumes a level of discipline that the development team and individual members of the development team would have to pull the next pieces of user stories or the next pieces of work and to break them down, to add questions, to add context, these types of things. I always like to tell my students that one of the biggest issues hasn't changed in decades, in over 100 years when it comes to business and development, and that business people come from a business context and want to understand the value, whereas the technical and development team is coming from the technical standpoint. And we need to match those together. We need to have a shared understanding between the business and the development team from a value proposition standpoint, as well as a technical slicing standpoint. And that's why it's so important when it comes to Agile that business people and developers work almost ideally daily throughout the project, so that there is an established shared understanding between what they're actually going to be working on. And so I believe that this is completely real Agile, whether you have a ceremony for it, whether it's once a week or twice a week, or if you're a mature Agile team and you do it asynchronously and it's a pull mechanism. Regardless, it's super important. One thing that I want to let everyone out there, our viewers, know that, at least in my opinion, in the experiences that I've had, is that there's a very simple function here. The more that you refine the backlog with a product owner and a development team, the smoother sprints go, number one. And number two, sprint planning goes even smoother. And some people will say, well, how does that work? Well, it's pretty simple. As I've witnessed it, we've already had contextual awareness of these next backlog items for the next sprint. We've already talked about them. In many cases, we've already sufficiently broken them down. And so it's not a surprise at the next sprint plan, which I'm sure some of our listeners might be like, oh man, I've experienced that, where the first time at a sprint planning, it's the first time the development team has actually seen the work. And then it's all questions. It's like, I don't understand what that is. Help me understand, how do you break that down? What's the value proposition? And so what you have in sprint planning is a lot of conversation that could have been knocked out before that sprint planning for that sprint. And so I always like to say that a little bit, and maybe I'll use a little bit of waterfall vernacular here, a little bit of pre-planning in terms of refinement of the backlog is very helpful for ensuring that your next sprint, as well as your sprint plan, goes exceedingly well. And so, is backlog refinement real Agile or BS? I agree with you, Bob. It is completely real Agile. The question is, for our viewers out there, how consistent are you going to be doing it? Or are you going to be creating ceremonies, or is it going to be an asynchronous activity? I'll leave you with the last word here, Bob.
I think it's important for teams to realize that it really will save you time in the long run. It's not a meeting that you do where you end up with, I spend 4 hours now or I spend 4 hours later. If you spend an hour or two every sprint now, you'll save a lot more time later, because imagine the scenario, and I ask teams all the time, how much faster would your sprint planning go if everybody walked into that meeting or ceremony or event already understanding all of the items at the top of our backlog? And the answer usually is it would save hours.
Mm,
How much faster would your sprint go if you already understood all those items and didn't have as many questions for the product owner? Well, I'd save many hours. The difference is that when we do this ahead of time, we don't have the pressure on us that we have when we're in the sprint, within sprint planning, or within the sprint itself. And so it's not as desperate, I guess. And when
mm,
we're desperate, things tend to take longer, and we tend to argue more, and we tend to be more assertive. when it's happening ahead of time, it's like, hey, we're going to need to know this in the next couple of days. And we get the answer in a couple of days and everybody's happy. Well, during the sprint, you can't say I need the answer in the next couple of days. I need it in the next couple of minutes.
Mm.
And everything is a fire drill. And I think that's where we lose a lot of our focus and time. So when we can do it ahead of time, it just eases that next sprint and the sprint after. I like to look 2 sprints ahead during backlog refinement, very specifically, because the work I'm doing today, I'm learning about things that'll be done in the future. So I have high knowledge about them. Let's apply that knowledge. Let's learn more. Let's be ready for the next couple of sprints. And I think it helps a ton.
Absolutely. And for coming from a technical background, I can tell you that I've received comments from developers and students that said, hey, the more that we refine the backlog, the smoother it is and the faster I can get back to work instead of trying to figure it all out on the spot before I develop. It's been great to have those conversations before we even get into the work. Well, thanks so much, guys, for joining us for another episode of Real Agile or BS. Leave your comments below. Let us know if you disagree with us or if you agree with us or if you're just alive. We appreciate you guys being here. Check us out at Agile Bob and at Agile Peter. You can always tweet us. But again, we'll see you guys here next time. Thanks for joining us.